He was a morbidly obese surgeon destined for an operating table and an early death. Now he's a rebel MD who is fabulously fit and fighting to make America healthy again. This is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia.
Welcome, folks. It's the Stay Off My Operating Table podcast with Dr. Philip Ovadia. And this is not a professional television studio, as you will occasionally notice people walking in the background. Our guest today is Zoe Harkham. I had never heard of this woman, so I did the thing that all the cool kids are doing now, and I went to Perplexity and said, who's this Zoe Harkham character who's going to be on our show? Phil, I just have to read this because I am so excited to hear from this woman. Zoe Harkham stands as a prominent and often controversial figure in the field of metabolic health, challenging conventional dietary wisdom through rigorous research and evidence-based critiques of mainstream nutritional guidelines. Her work has significantly influenced discussions around obesity, diabetes management, and metabolic dysfunction, positioning her as both an advocate for alternative dietary approaches and a critic of established nutritional orthodoxy. I am so glad you're here with us today, Zoe.
I didn't know my mum worked for Perplexity. That's really nice, isn't it?
Pretty good work, yeah. All right, Phil, I've done my bit. I'm just going to sit and listen and probably butt in way too often and ask questions.
Awesome. Yeah, I think Perplexity actually did a pretty good job with that. I honestly don't know why it's taken us so long to have Zoe on. Maybe the big ocean between us, I guess, has made it a little challenging, but I put her up at the pinnacle of she crosses the line between investigator, researcher, and journalist, but she's really done a lot of the, I would say, major lifting when it comes to explaining and spreading the message about health and these what shouldn't be controversial, but for some reason are things that she talks about, and excited to come to some of her work and maybe some of the ground moving or ground shaking things that she's done. There have been some trials that we can talk about as of late, but maybe I would say Zoe's, we'll say, educational background was around math and science. And maybe one of the first things I'd like to hear, Zoe, is how you went from being essentially a kind of a financial quant to getting interested in nutrition and obesity, and what that sort of transition was like for you.
Okay, there are some things going on in parallel. Firstly, thank you very much for those very kind introductions. Things going on in parallel. So my brother developed type 1 diabetes when he was 15 and I was 13. So that was the big life moment of, okay, insulin, sugar, hypers, recognizing signs, trying to do the best by your brother. So that was my sort of first big thing. Then went to Cambridge University. People were very obsessed with food. Eating disorders were starting to take hold, particularly in young women at the time. And obesity was starting to take off. We were a little bit behind the US. And I just became quite fascinated with obesity because it's one of those paradoxes. People don't want to be obese, people don't want to be overweight. And yet we are heading towards 2/3 of the population being obese or overweight. And it's not going to be long. I looked at some projections recently before 2050 US, they're forecasting 2 out of 3 will actually be obese. It's just incredible. So anyway, I've always had it there on the back burner that I've been really interested in this. Left Cambridge, had what my mum would call a proper career, management consultancy, travelled, worked in the US, then went to work for Mars, yes, the candy company, fantastic place to work, just a shame about the products, where I did finance, manufacturing, marketing, sales, then ended up in human resources, got headhunted by then from GlaxoSmithKline, so went from big food to big drugs, so I've seen it all from the inside. Then met the guy that you saw setting us up at the top of the hour, my tech support, my husband, who lives in Wales and moved to Wales, more big companies, but came to about 2010 and got the opportunity to leave the corporate world and to pursue my passion, which is diet and health. And by that time, I'd had a book published in 2004. While I was HR director, as I was at that time, I ended up as VP for human resources, working for some pretty big global companies. So I'd written one book, then I wrote two more in 2008, which is quite something when you're still trying to be an HR director at the same time. And then 2010 thought, okay, let's walk away from the big salary, the nice bonuses and all the rest of it. And let's just see if Andy and I can make a living, I guess, out of what we really enjoy. And we've managed to do that. As anyone knows who walks away from the big food and the big pharma, you don't end up with the bucks that you do in those fields, but you end up with much more life satisfaction and much more of a sense that you're actually doing something more worthwhile with your life. So that's where I am at the moment.
That's probably a pretty unique perspective, have been inside both of the industries that many of us think are largely contributing to making our health worse in the end, even though certainly the pharmaceutical industry is, at least on the surface, dedicated to make our health better. And you would hope the food industry might have some interest in that, but we know that they don't. Maybe that's not necessarily their primary profit motive. But, what kind of perspective did that give you? And as you were working with and for these companies, did you realize sort of how they were contributing to these growing problems?
Yeah, really good question, actually. You could hardly get two more different organizations than Mars and GlaxoSmithKline. And I was there just on the cusp of the GlaxoSmithKline Beecham takeover. So Mars was still a private corporation at the time that I worked for it. So it was actually run by the first generation down from John Mars Sr. So it was run by John, Forrest, and Jackie Mars. And then because it would have passed down to too many people at the next generation, it's now, I understand, run by a committee, by a panel. So it's still a private organization. So you can look very long term. There's no external shareholder pressure. There's no short-termism. I loved working. Mars is one of the best companies in the world. In fact, I don't think you will find a better company to work for in terms of the freedom that they give people from a very early age. The Mars values are values that most people would aspire to, things like mutuality. If relationships aren't win-win for both parties, they're not going to endure. Quality, the importance of the customer is king, all of that kind of stuff. Fantastic company, great values. But it did get to the point where I moved from the electronics division, which made coin mechanisms, not many people know that, into the actual candy division. And I remember one day we were having a management meeting talking about, there was a lot of pressure at the time in the UK from mums who were saying, when we get to the grocery checkout, we've got all these candy at children's eye height. So we've got the kid going, Mummy, I want some Peppa Pig, I want some brightly coloured candy. And the management team meeting was talking about how do we overcome this resistance, because these mums' movements are pretty powerful. And I remember sitting in the meeting thinking, I'm actually on the side of the mums. I don't think we should be contributing to this pester power. I don't like this anymore. This doesn't feel good. And then, of course, out of the frying pan into the fire, you move over into GlaxoSmithKline. You've got shareholders. The vision at a company like GSK is quarterly. It's not even annual, let alone Mars, which could look 10, 20 years ahead. It's quarterly. What results are you going to post this quarter? You're under shareholder pressure. You inevitably hold something back this quarter because you've got to have something to give them next quarter, but you've got to be seen to be growing almost every quarter, which is just ridiculous. And I didn't quite appreciate at the time the harm that a lot of the drugs do that are put into people. And I guess in defense of both organizations, I look back on it now and I don't blame them, because it is not Mars's job to clean up the health. It's not Mars's job to make America healthy again. It's not GSK's job to make America healthy again. Mars's job is to protect the organization going forward on a long-term shareholder-free basis. GSK's objective is to shareholders, employees, to not pollute the environment in the rivers and all that kind of thing. But it's to make profit. It's to make profit, to pay people good salaries and to keep the shareholders happy. It is not their job to question whether or not people should be taking quite so many statins, antidepressants, GLP-1 medications and all the rest of it. So I don't blame those guys. That is their job. I blame people who should preside over our public health. So the people who set the dietary guidelines, public health bodies who tell us to stay out of the sun, don't get vitamin D, being healthy isn't really going to help with any kind of infection. You better just go and do what your doctor tells you to do. I haven't seen a single piece of public health advice that I would actually just not completely reverse and say, okay, just do the exact opposite of what they tell you to do. And now it's probably good advice.
Yeah, said we oftentimes talk about on this program that you really shouldn't be depending on the food industry, right, to fix the problem for you, or the pharmaceutical industry to fix the problem for you. And even per your last comment, right, I don't think we can rely on the government. Maybe there are some glimmers of hope on that front starting to show, but really this is up to individuals to try and resist sort of the environment that's been created. Although I do oftentimes think about it, it's been, you even mentioned it, right? It's widely accepted now that these companies can't go around causing widespread pollution. And yet we do let them get away with wreaking havoc on our health, which is, and I agree, it maybe isn't their primary focus, or isn't their primary focus, but maybe it should at least be a secondary consideration. And it doesn't seem to be, especially on the side of the food. The pharmaceutical companies, I do understand that they are trying to, come up with innovative ways and better ways to treat disease. I question some of the tactics that they use when they're developing these pharmaceuticals and bringing them to market. And that, I know you have a lot to say about that. And maybe we'll lead into your recent entanglement with the statin industry. But do you think these companies, even looking at it, like you said, Mars is a private company that's trying to look decades ahead, and shouldn't they be thinking, if we can keep people healthier while feeding them, that ultimately is good both for our bottom line and for society?
No, I don't think they think like that. There was no evidence when I was with Mars that we were moving into anything healthier in any way, shape, or form. They didn't come out with a low-calorie Mars bar or other products, or alternative products. It was very much just about, why not have some of this? We're not saying that people should have Mars bars all day long, but it's this sort of, oh, go on, it's a treat, it's okay. One isn't going to hurt you. A snack is perfectly fine as part of a healthy diet. So that was very much the message that was coming from Mars. And the trouble is, when you work in the field that we do, and I know your background as well, and I've been really interested in, I've had my own relationship with food in the past. I think most people have. I've been on boards, because when I was an HR director, you get invited onto boards. So I was on the board of the National Health Service in Wales. I've been on the board of Cardiff Metropolitan University, and Cardiff developed a food technology lab while I was there. So I was really interested. I'm going around as one of the board members, but I'm also looking around this lab, and it just blew me away. So they've got students. It's perfect putting food tech labs on university campuses, because you've got students and they will do anything for $10. So you put them in a tiny little square cubicle and you feed them something through the hatch, and it's a new crisp. And they've got to write down, what was the crunch? How was it when it first went? The detail is unbelievable. When it first went in your mouth, what was the taste on the tongue? How long did it last? When did you sort of think, what was your aftertaste? Pass it back through the hatch with your score sheet. Back comes another product. And they just get the perfect products. It's the perfect bliss. It's the perfect fat carbohydrate combo, which does not occur naturally in nature, apart from in nuts. That's the only food where nature will put fat and carbohydrate in good amounts. And those can be quite Moorish, as we all know. If you're sat next to a bowl of nuts at a party, you start having one and then you'll just want the whole thing. It's that unique fat carb combo that we can't deal with. And they deliberately design the product so that the second you put it in your mouth, you have this incredible sensation. You want to put the next one in, and then the next one, and then you want to do it the next day and the next day, and you want more and more of it. So this whole idea of, oh, just have one Mars bar and it'll be fine as part of a healthy diet, it just doesn't work. That's not actually what they're trying to get you to do. If you end up addicted to Mars products, or addicted to Pringles crisps or kettle chips, whatever it is, they really don't mind. In fact, they're actually quite delighted, because that is the sales of their product assured for the next few months.
Yeah, and I think really that you hit the nail on the head as to where the trouble is. Like you said, it's one thing to say, okay, have this as an occasional treat, but then if you're specifically engineering it so that you know that people can't just have it as an occasional treat, that I think is where a lot of this problem comes from. And I understand it from the business perspective. Unfortunately, we now have to deal with the health outcomes from that. And I don't know what the answer is, right? Because if you're a food company and you're making food that isn't addictive, you're not going to be really fulfilling your mission as a corporation.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
let me make
I
a
mean, one
suggestion.
solution. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go,
Let me
Jack.
make a suggestion. How about we not lie about what's healthy? I was so excited when I read this bio of Zoe Harkham because it sounds to me like she is an iconoclast. And I love it when people gore sacred cows, especially when those cows desperately need to be gored. I love that you come from this background. So you've got this insight into the types of chemicals that are poisoning us. It gives you a stick to beat people over the head with who think you don't know what you're talking about. But I was super excited to hear about your research. That's what I think that's where you've made your mark, and that's why I want to hear from you. Let's talk about this. I'm going to go back and reread it because it was just said so well. You basically called bullshit on the low fat dietary guidelines that were introduced in the United States in 1977, the United Kingdom in 1983. And I don't think this is the line I love. I should say this. Her analysis showed that only 6 randomized controlled trials involving fewer than 2,500 predominantly sick men
Entirely sick
were
men.
used to justify dietary recommendations affecting hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah.
That's what I want to hear about. Unpack that.
Okay, so
Yeah,
that was
and
my
we'll just
PhD. Yeah, sorry, Philip.
I was just going to set the stage and say this was your doctoral thesis that led to
Yeah.
you getting a PhD in, I think it's public health science. Did I get that right? But
Yeah, or public health nutrition, yeah, or
public health
specifically dietary
nutrition.
guidelines, yeah. It stemmed from my interest in obesity. So when I saw obesity taken off, and it just made no sense because people don't want to be obese. So why are they getting obese? To understand why something happened, you need to go back and look at when it happened. And there's this great NHANES chart in America. I opened my obesity book with it, and obesity literally takes off like an airplane at about between 1976 and 1980. So you go back to that point and you say, okay, did something happen? Did we start eating more? No, we actually didn't. The evidence doesn't show that. Did we start doing less? No, if anything, the evidence shows that's when the sort of the whole lycra gym movement, Jane Fonda aerobics that all took off. So we don't have the classic calorie deficit. One thing that did happen is that we changed our dietary guidelines, and you guys went first. So you had the Senator McGovern Committee in 1977, the failed presidential candidate wanted to make a name for himself, and he held this sort of review of nutrition. He'd just been on a Pritikin camp boot camp, so he was very much wedded to the low fat, high carb diet because he had just literally experienced it. And then, of course, from that 1977 committee came the 1980 dietary guidelines for Americans. The UK followed in 1983, and then various other countries followed suit. And you guys still do them every 5 years. So you have this sort of system now of the review of the dietary guidelines. So what I wanted to do is to go back and say, why did we change the dietary guidelines? That was pretty easy to find out. So we changed them in the name of heart disease. It was believed that fat caused heart disease, and therefore we needed to introduce low-fat guidelines. Now, this was a penny drop moment for me. If you picture a little circle in front of you, a little pie chart, protein tends to be really constant in any natural diet, and it's actually not that different, a vegetarian diet with a normal sort of omnivore diet. It's about 15 to 20% of the diet. So the minute you set a cap on either fat or carbohydrate, you have immediately got the other macronutrient to take up the slack. So they set a dietary guideline of no more than 30% of your calories should be in the form of total fat, and no more than 10% should be in the form of saturated fat. So that 30% chunk of the circle that is fat immediately leaves 55% in the form of carbohydrate. Now, they never tested that. They never said, oh, I wonder if 55% of the diet in the form of carbohydrate is safe, let alone healthy. They never tested that. It was just the default of demonizing fat. So I then went into, okay, let's imagine. So my PhD said, let's imagine I am the Dietary Guidelines Committee back in 1977, 1983. What evidence was available at the time? I'm going to look at randomized controlled trials because that's the highest form of evidence. And then I'm going to look at population studies because there were some good population studies around the time. People will have heard of Framingham, they'll have heard of the 7 countries study, maybe the General Electric study and so on. There's some good studies. So I thought that's all of the RCTs. And this is the bit that Jack has just mentioned. That was the first paper to come from the PhD. Let's pool all the RCTs together in meta-analysis because that is literally the highest evidence that you can get hold of. And one of the huge findings was there were only 6 randomized controlled trials. They had only studied men, and they were all sick men for that first paper, fewer than 2,500 in total. So we had never studied women. We had never studied healthy people. We had really not studied that many people. And hey, by the way, when I went to look at the Dietary Guidelines document, which is nearly 900 pages long, largely written by a vegetarian called Mark Hegstead, he didn't even refer to those dietary trials. He didn't even seem to be aware of them. They weren't looking at the evidence before they set these guidelines. So there were so many findings from that first paper. Cholesterol did fall in the intervention trials. That would be because the interventions contain plant sterols, because they were vegetable fats as opposed to animal fats. That's why cholesterol fell. It made absolutely no difference to heart deaths or all-cause deaths in any of the single trials or when they were all pulled together. And quite a few of those trials actually cautioned. The final line in a lot of those papers is, one of them you'll love, Philip, it says, a low-fat diet has no place in the treatment of myocardial infarction. Another one says, we are quite concerned about the potential toxicity of our intervention, which was vegetable oil. And another one said there's been more events in the intervention group. We're a bit concerned about, again, the toxicity of our intervention. So the evidence at the time should have said, don't do this. Then the second part of my PhD, just to wrap up, was to say, okay, we're not in 1983, 77 anymore. We're in 2016, which is when I did my PhD. Let's just look at all the evidence now. There's got to be more evidence. Surely, if we were doing those dietary guidelines again, we'd be overwhelmed with evidence as to why we should have those dietary fat guidelines. Spoiler alert, there is no more evidence now than there was back then. You've got the Women's Health Initiative, you've got the Minnesota Coronary Survey. They did not provide any more evidence in support of a low-fat diet than we originally had at the time. So there is no evidence whatsoever for the low-fat diet, but it doesn't stop them pushing it at every opportunity.
There's kind of 2 things that amaze me about that process as it went on back then. And number one is what you alluded to. And I believe McGovern has a quote from the hearings where he says, we don't have the luxury of waiting for scientific evidence, essentially. This was felt to be a public health emergency, and we have to do something. So let's just choose this thing that has no evidence behind it, like you said, and actually had the evidence, as you alluded to, was largely going against it, right? This was not a good thing. There were really no scientific evidence even suggesting that this would work and that it might be harmful. And then the other thing is the guidelines specifically say in them that they're not intended to treat or manage any disease, right? These are supposed to be guidelines for healthy people. And yet, as you said, the science, the limited science that was maybe entered into the process was all on sick people. And to think that we could learn from, even if you accepted the fact that a low-fat diet might benefit someone with heart disease, what does that have to do with the healthy population? And it just amazes me that there wasn't forethought. And I don't know how much you were able to determine, I guess, how sort of unanimous was this committee, or was there a lot of dissent at the time? Because one of the things that strikes me is, even if you say, okay, low-fat diet is healthy, there's really no good way of constructing a low-fat diet without processing the food. And that's what we saw came out of this. The food industry said, okay, you want low-fat food, we can make low-fat food, but we got to start pulling stuff out and putting stuff in, largely sugar and carbohydrates, and to make this palatable. And without that, so the natural side effect of this was it pushed us towards a more processed diet. And I think a lot of we'll say, people today who talk about healthy patterns of eating, right? And you have controversies around, is it more plant-based? Is it more animal-based? But I think almost everyone can agree at this point, it comes back to eating real food more so than the processed food. And so this is what set off the processed food movement. Prior to that, there really wasn't a lot of processed food around.
Yeah. You quoted Robert Olson, it was, who asked Senator McGovern, we really don't have the evidence. We've got no evidence that this is going to be safe or healthy. We've got some major concerns. And he just sort of brushed them all aside and said, we just don't have time. And you had interested parties as part of that process. So you would have concerns expressed by the dairy industry, and they were, because they were the guys who were really going to be in the firing line. Meat, slightly less so at that time, but very definitely dairy. But of course, the food industry, the fake food industry, jumped on it immediately. As you say, you want low fat? I can give you low fat. I can take the fat out of yogurt. I can take the fat out of milk, and then I can sell it as cream. I get two products for one. I can make you low fat muffins, low fat biscuits. It just, everything became low fat, and it was this explosion. And when you said earlier on, and we were talking about the food industry, and it's not their job to try to make us healthier, and should they not be trying to make us healthier because we are their customers long term? No, my view would be, when I blame the governments and the public health, just keep those companies out of anything to do with public health, particularly food policy.
How hard
so if
is
you look
this?
at anything from the Olympics in the UK, I had a paper in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. So when our own guidelines were last updated, which was in 2016, they used to have something, they called it the Eat Plate. I called it the Eat Badly Plate. And they changed it to the Eat Guide, Eat Badly Guide. And I had a look at the people who put together that guide. And there were 11 people on the committee. They'd been invited by Public Health England to form this committee to come up with the revised guidelines. 8 out of 11 were not representatives of one company. They were representatives of entire food industry bodies. So you would have the Institute for Grocery Distribution, the Food and Drink Federation. You could not name a fake food company or a high street outlet, Pizza Hut, Burger King, Kentucky Fried Chicken, whatever, were all represented by these organizations. 8 out of 11 putting together this plate. So inevitably they're saying have cereal for breakfast, because of course Kellogg's are all over these things. They're all over every study that tells you to have breakfast. They are endemic in our food policy. And if somebody could just, whether it is RFK or whatever, if somebody can just come in and say, I set a law, nobody who is anywhere near a food company or a food industry body gets anywhere near public health dietary guidelines or setting policy, then you might start to at least get the real food message. We would still then need to have the debate as to what that real food should be. And there is actually a definitive answer. It's not an art, it's a science. We know what humans need in terms of macronutrients, micronutrients. We know where we find them. We know where we find them in the form that the human body wants them, which is animal foods. And I could cite you the nutrients that prove that. It's not up for debate, but let's at least get the real food principle embedded in our dietary advice, and then let's start arguing about what that real food should be.
Are you aware of any countries that have sort of contradictory to this dietary guidelines that are in line with what we both believe to be the healthiest way to eat?
Oh, wow. I do remember quite a few years ago, somebody sent me something, and don't get me wrong on this, but I think it might have been Brazil. There was one country that seemed to have gone out with pictures of real food, and it was real food. There's always a junk segment somewhere on dietary advice. I seem to remember it didn't have a junk segment. And I don't know why Brazil is the only one that's sticking in my head at the moment, but just about everywhere else, you look at any of the diagrams, whether it's pyramids or plates or dietary guidelines for Americans or the Australian dietary advice. I've looked at quite a few of them. I looked at the South African guidelines for Prof Noakes, and just before I went down to a conference in South Africa, and they're all giving this mantra that comes out of the mad Harvard epidemiological papers of, oh, the best diet is whole grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, high carb, low fat products that, quite frankly, are certainly not indigenous to where I live and may or may not be indigenous to where you guys live, but they're certainly not the healthiest foods anyway.
Amazing. Let's pivot now to pharmaceutical industry, and let's talk about the lawsuit that you were involved in, that you actually launched along with Malcolm Kendrick, and talk about, maybe give the background as to what led to that, and then we can talk about what the ultimate outcome of that was, because it ended up being pretty interesting for people that are looking at how the pharmaceutical industry actually works.
Okay, I guess one point of clarity is it wasn't a lawsuit about the pharmaceutical industry. And I don't talk about this much, actually. So I'll just share sort of what I'm okay sharing, where I'm at, that it's done, it's gone. Anyway, there were some articles in March 2019. The newspaper was the Mail on Sunday. You'll probably be familiar with Mail Online. Mail Online is Associated Newspapers. It's the Mail on Sunday and it's the Daily Mail. And it was actually a journalist that I'd worked with for several years previously. He was a recipient of my Monday note. So he would get my regular dissections on, does red meat cause cancer? No, just what I do on a regular basis, and had used a lot of my research in the past for articles, and had sort of he had got me involved in quite a few of his articles over the years. I don't know what then happened, but anyway, these articles hit the Sunday newspaper early in March 2019, and in sort of the words of the lawyer that we contacted pretty soon after that, she had never seen anything like it. And I'm glad they're not on the internet anymore. You will be able to find them in the judgment of the trial, but they're not on the internet anymore, because part of our win, and we did win, was that they needed to come down because they were shown to be defamatory. So the case wasn't about the pharmaceutical industry. It wasn't about statins. It was a pure and simple libel law in the UK. Libel law is very different in every country. Incredibly, it surprised me. You can say some pretty nasty things about someone, but you have some defenses. And if you can show, if I can remember the defenses, that what you said was your honest opinion, that could be a defense. If you could say that it was the truth, that could be a defense. If you could show that it was in the public interest, that could be a defense. If I said, oh, Michael Phelps is a rubbish swimmer, it's defamatory. It's clearly not the truth, because he's not a rubbish swimmer, and it cannot possibly be my honest opinion, because he's demonstrably anything other than a bad swimmer. And it's not in the public interest, because it's in the public interest that he's portrayed in the correct way, which is he's a fantastic Olympian. So the newspaper, we launched the lawsuit. Things got a bit delayed with COVID. We didn't end up going to trial until summer of 23, and we got the judgment summer of 24, and it still wasn't over at that point. And I think costs are still being fought over, but we've won. Costs have been awarded to us. The only thing they're arguing over is, do they pay? This always happens, I understand. You lose a defamation suit, you then try to claim you shouldn't have to pay 100% of the cost, you should pay some other percentage. It doesn't involve me or Malcolm anymore. We're out, we've won, the articles are down, and they issued an apology, which is up online. So it was pure and simple UK defamation law. I guess it was interesting from a perspective of people who work in our field, in that it did allow quite a lot to be shared in open court about just how many people question statins. And it would have been difficult for us to win if we had been fringe loonies, put it that way. So the idea that we are by no means alone in questioning the balance of harm and benefit from statins. You've got people from JAMA, from the New England Medical Journal. You've very esteemed scientists around the world who will talk about the number needed to treat, the number needed to harm, but just how bad are the side effects. The people who push statins will argue that they're very rare and most people don't suffer from them. Just open up the patient leaflet. You've got a list saying you've got a 1 in 10 likelihood of suffering these, and these are some pretty nasty conditions. You've got lawsuits on statins and type 2 diabetes. They really had a difficult time of it to show this is a mad, crazy position. These are flat earthers or whatever. These are just completely mad nuts people, because you're not. If you are a non-conflicted person challenging some of the truths, whether it's in pharmaceuticals or fake food or whatever, you might be in a minority. You shouldn't be in a minority. You should be in the majority, but you are by no means pushing a non-evidence-based, non-important opinion. And you are entitled to your opinion. And it is not in the public interest, therefore, to silence somebody like me or Malcolm, because it's in the public interest that the public know both what the statin companies would like them to know, but also what people who are not funded by the statin companies think that people should know. It's in the public interest that people know both sides of an argument, and therefore shutting down that debate was not held to be in the public interest.
Yeah, and sort of in the, I guess, classic sense, instead of attacking what you were talking about, proving what you and Malcolm were saying about statins to be wrong, they instead took the approach of basically personally attacking you and Malcolm. And that's what, and again, the court sided with you that what you were saying really couldn't be proven to be untrue, essentially. And therefore, this was part of the argument as to why this was defamatory against you and Dr. Kendrick. And it, again, just, I think what it should demonstrate to us is this is something that should be debated, right? And this is something that should be up for discussion. And we see it time and again from my side as a clinician, and Dr. Kendrick would have similar experiences, that you simply cannot question that statins are the end all and be all when it comes to fighting heart disease. And when I say simple things like, then why hasn't it worked? Because we've had statins now for 40 plus years and heart disease isn't getting better, it's getting worse. That seems like a fairly high level contradictory thing to me. And yet when I say things like that, I get attacked on a regular basis from other clinicians because I'm questioning this dogma, which cannot be questioned.
It's really funny. I can cite stuff that's in the judgment because it's publicly available, so there's no risk of sharing that. What appeared to set all of this off was I'd done a Monday note very early in 2019. So the usual group that do all the statin meta-analyses, so they're based in Oxford, just up the road from where I live. It's the CTSU, the cholesterol treatment trialists, whatever, I can't remember what all their acronyms stand for, but they're the ones who pump out the statin meta-analyses, and they won't allow access to the raw data. So I've tried to get it, Malcolm Kendrick has tried to get it, Dr. Marianne Damasi has tried to get it. So they published their latest meta-analysis early in 2019, and they didn't put this particular bit in the paper because that would then be on record in the Lancet. So they held a press release alongside, and they had headlines then all the next day. An Oxford press release, Lancet publication, who makes the front of the Times, the Telegraph, all the posh newspapers in the UK. And it was 8,000 lives could be saved if all the elderly, the over 75s were on statins. So I went to have a look at the paper, which is what I do every Monday. And you look at the data in the paper and you look at the impact on all deaths and cardiovascular disease deaths in the over 75s. I looked at the over 70s, I looked at all the data in the paper, and it was not statistically significant. And all the claims that they were making, all the separate bits were not, it's like primary prevention, not statistically significant. Over 75s, not statistically significant. It was a falsehood. And I called them out on it. So I wrote to the Lancet, but obviously they didn't publish that. And I did my Monday note on this, and I said, this is not shown in the paper. Here are the facts. So the journalist had actually forwarded that to the group at Oxford to say, you know, what make you of this kind of thing? And they never ever replied to him to say she's wrong and this is why she's wrong, because I wasn't wrong. And it came up in the trial. And it was really interesting because at one point our barrister was quizzing the journalist when he was on the stand. And she said, okay, take me through this paper here. And why did Dr. Harkham make this assertion and why did she claim that? And he couldn't answer it. He didn't know. And it's all in the judgments. She's saying to him, you didn't really understand this Mr. Journalist, did you? And he had to admit on the stand, no, I didn't. Her stuff is quite clever or something like that. I forget his words. I was trying not to laugh. But the judge actually put in this really interesting passage in the judgment where he said, and from what I've looked at it, she was right, which then goes a long way to saying he can't be attacking these people and saying I won't repeat any of the defamation because that's when you do get into trouble. But again, it's in the judgment. You can see what was said about us. And he was saying, no, you have no right to be saying this of these people. They are decent folk. They have integrity. They have not these things that you're accusing them of. They just don't stack up. And the judge's own perception was, no, I think she's right. That could not be proven from the paper as shown. It's really quite nice. I've got a note on my site, actually, which is my Monday notes that ended up in the Royal Courts of Justice. And I can't remember how many it was, but it was a handful of my Monday notes actually ended up in this judgment, because then another one would be raised and she was right here, wasn't she? Yes. And another one, no, and she was right here, wasn't she? And that just, it didn't stack up. You can't just, as you say, go and attack the person because you don't like somebody attacking the science. Have a fair fight on the science. You know, that would be the decent thing to do. Have a fair fight on the science. Public interest would have been, right, double page spread in the Mail on Sunday, get Professor Rory Collins from the Statin group, the fact that he's had over $400 million from pharmaceutical companies, just declare that at the end. Put me on the other side, no conflicts of interest. My business model is that if people like what I write, they give me $1 a week. Thank you very much. And then just let the public decide who puts together the compelling argument, and may the best person win, or may the reader think, okay, good points there. I'll go away and decide what I think. But that was being taken away from the UK population with those articles. So I'm glad. I had regrets, God, when it dragged on 5 years and the stakes were so high. Clearly, there were times when you just think, what are we doing? But of course, you get to the end and you win and you think, okay, yeah, I'm glad I took that on. Not sure I would again, but I'm glad we did that.
Yeah, I'm certainly glad you did that. And I think it will be a big help moving forward, because this is now something that can be sort of pointed to and hopefully be allowed to open up this discussion. And quite frankly, it doesn't just impact the discussion around statins and cholesterol in a lot of ways. And you in the UK are maybe seeing it more so than the US, is even this attempt to just not allow the discussion to happen in these sort of attacks on free speech, and especially heinous when it comes to science, because science is all about, right, testing and disproving hypotheses. And if we're not allowed to have the discussion about the hypothesis around high cholesterol causing heart disease maybe being wrong, then we've lost any chance we have at progress being made, scientific progress being made.
Yeah, no, it's certainly made the case that you can't silence debate, or you will likely lose a defamation suit if you attack people and try to silence debate in the process. Yeah, I think one of our barristers does training for journalists. So she will go and talk to journalists about defamation law and about things that you need to be careful about. And I remember in all the discussions, because we obviously got to know our team really well over the years and walking into court with them over 2 weeks. And she said there are a lot of learnings here for journalists that they're going to need to take on board. It is going to become a landmark case in terms of what you can do and what you can't do. And let's hope it does clean things up a little bit in the process.
Well, I'm thrilled that a court of law said, yeah, you can't tell lies and then complain when people call bullshit on it. And that's big. I know that's big. But to me, the biggest thing is just simply that we have somebody who's actually done the research on where all this crap started and has, Zoe, I've been in the middle of this with Phil now for over 4 years now, week after week. This is the first time I've ever heard, oh yeah, all that stuff came from studying 2,500 sick men. So to me, that seems like that would be a pretty important thing for us to all know. Oh yeah, all these low-fat dietary guidelines came out of the worst presidential candidate in American history until 2024. And who suffered the worst electoral college defeat in presidential history, who basically ignored all the science and drove this. And now this guy and his committee are directly responsible for, I don't think it's at all hyperbolic to say the work of that committee and George McGovern are directly responsible for millions of deaths that didn't have to occur. Not millions. That's a big deal to me. My wife's best friend was over yesterday. Her husband is dealing with a significant health problem, and we've tried to communicate to her. Probably be a good idea if he wasn't getting the bulk of his calories from carbohydrates. And this is a smart woman, very successful in her field of endeavor, and she absolutely believes the low-fat dogma. And her husband is very diligently making sure that it's better than eating candy bars all day, I guess, but not much.
It's exactly the same. It's just exactly the same. I do one of my presentations on what we should eat, and I talk about carbohydrates 101. And you go through the single sugars, glucose, fructose, and galactose. You go through the disaccharides. Let's just take one of them, which would be sucrose, which is one molecule of glucose, one molecule of fructose. You get up into the polysaccharides, many sugars. And I sort of say to them when I'm going through this in the presentation, every time you hear the word saccharide, it means sugar. And you should be thinking sugars. And when I'm talking to you about carbohydrates, in your mind the whole time, you should be thinking sugars, because that's all they are. They either are single sugars, fructose and glucose, or they break down into sugars. But that's all that carbohydrates are. And then people say, oh, but it's very different, isn't it? Eating a candy bar and having an apple. And I just laugh, like, how? It breaks down into glucose and fructose. How is it any different? You get sucrose in a candy bar, you get glucose and fructose in an apple. They might not be in that perfect 50-50 ratio, but the body doesn't know where it came from. The body just says, incoming 10 grams of glucose, 10 grams of fructose, incoming 10 grams of glucose, 10 grams of fructose. I need to deal with those. Fructose goes to the liver, hello, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Glucose goes into the bloodstream, hello, type 2 diabetes, inflammation, and one day you'll end up on Philip's operating table. The body has no idea. This idea that the body's going, oh, that was an apple, jolly good. That was a candy bar. Oh, not quite the same. It's madness. It's just madness. Like, where do you get this stuff from? You're in cuckoo land.
Yeah, it really is. Maybe let's try and end this on a high note. What are you excited about? What do you think needs to happen in the future? And do you see any evidence that maybe it's going to happen?
I've obviously got one eye on what's going on with RFK, not least because I won't name names, but I know some people working pretty closely with some of the people, working pretty closely with RFK. Early signs are not bowling me over, I have to say. When I hear about, oh, we'll do something about dye, food dyes, don't eat anything that's got food dye. There you go. You don't have to worry about food dye. They're not going after the big thing. I see a lot too much as well going on ultra processed foods. Oh, if only we just steer people away from these junk foods, these ultra processed foods, then everything will be fine. No, back to the apple is basically a candy bar to the body. We've got to stop. They're diversions to me. Food dyes, ultra processed food, all diversions. We've got to start having this carbohydrate question, because we got that pie thing wrong. When we put that 30% in and we had the 55% by default, as I said, we didn't know it was safe, let alone if it was healthy. We have now got 40 years of evidence that it clearly is not looking healthy or safe. We have explosions of obesity, type 2 diabetes, inflammatory conditions, autoimmune conditions, heart disease, cancer, and so on. So it's just really not going very well. So we've got to have this carbohydrate conversation. But I cannot see them moving away from the whole grain, legume, fruits and vegetables advice, which they hilariously call the Mediterranean diet. Now, I'm lucky I live nearer the Mediterranean. I go to the Mediterranean at least once a year. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 times a year. That would be France, Spain, Malta, Greece, any countries bordering the Med, Cyprus, we're going in September. I can tell you, if you could sum up the Mediterranean diet in one sentence, it would be, if it moves, eat it. So they will eat snails, they will eat frog's legs, they will eat rabbit, they will eat horse, they will eat things that would horrify Americans, but they will eat anything that moves. They have not, that you will not find a whole grain in the Mediterranean. I've been looking in the Mediterranean for 30 years. I have never seen a whole grain. If you go to Italy, the bread is white. It's ciabatta. It's white in French. It's the big French stick. Pasta is white. Rice is white. Arborio rice, risotto rice. It is all white. There are no whole grains. If they have legumes, it's a few legumes in a dish. So it might be a sort of lamb tagine that might have some chickpeas in it, but the base of the dish is lamb, because if it moves, we eat it. Their desserts are cream based, they're not sugar based. They have creme brulee, they have tiramisu, they have rich ice cream. They don't have low fat ice cream in France. They'll put cream in their coffee. You don't have low fat milk in France. This Mediterranean diet is a complete construct from the likes of the Harvard researchers that want to put this push this high grain, low fat diet on us. And that's the debate that we need to have. And I don't see any evidence that we're getting any closer to having that debate. We are going to be the enlightened. If you want to join our club, you want to improve your health, listen to us and take your own health in your own hands. Don't wait for RFK or any people at the top to sort it out, because I'm sorry, guys, it's just not going to happen. It's down to you and me.
Yeah, very well said. And I'll tell people one of the best ways you can start doing that is subscribing to Zoe's newsletter. It comes out every Monday, and it really is a must read for anyone interested in these topics. Zoe, maybe you can tell people where they should go to subscribe to that and connect with you.
Yeah, I don't think I've got a name up there, is it? It's just my name. ZoeHarkham.com is my website. On X, I'm at Zoe Harkham. I do say something on X every day or so, but some people are on X 24 hours a day. Like, enough already. I'm sure I'm not going to get to my deathbed and think, gosh, I wish I spent more time on social media. So I'm quite happy spending time with family, friends, and dissecting academic articles. And then my life is full of joy.
This has been, I want to have her back, Phil. I have a list of things I want her to talk about because, like I said, I'm stunned. I'm 4 years into this journey, and this is the first time I've heard this particularly potent and noxious fact about our dietary guidelines. I knew it was junk anyway, but I never heard, oh yeah, by the way, lousy random controlled trials, sick people, not applicable to the general population. I want more. So
If you
I'm putting
just
in
for a
my
little bit of,
I'm putting
for a
in
bit
my
of
order.
disrespect, go on my website, zoeharkham.com, click on type of content videos, look for my fiber presentation, because that's probably one of my more disrespectful presentations about fiber, because that's a big myth that we need to slay, because that's how they try to justify carbohydrates.
Oh yeah.
Take away the fiber myth, they've got no justification left for carbohydrates. The whole
How are you going to live without fiber? Yes. All right, folks, our guest has been Dr. Zoe Harkham. I promise you, I've never made a promise to you before, we're going to have Zoe back because we got to have more. I stumbled onto this video, Phil, on her website. The title is Why Vegans Have Smaller Brains. Oh my God. We're gonna get in so much trouble, but hey, that's what we're here for. All right. We'll make sure all the contact information shows up in the show notes, so you don't have to wreck your car trying to write it down. Just click on the link. Phil, I realize I haven't been well behaved, but wow.
Wow, indeed. Keep up the great work, Zoe. And like I said, I really do encourage everyone to check out your work. And thank you for everything you've done.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's been real fun. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your work. I really do. Follow her on X, folks. Check out her website, zoeharkham.com. And join us next time at Stay Off My Operating Table. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Chances are you wouldn't be listening to this podcast if you didn't need to change your life and get healthier. So take action right now. Book a call with Dr. Ovadia's team. One small step in the right direction is all it takes to get started. Contact us at ifixhearts.com/talk. That's ifixhearts.com/talk.